Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Wine Advocates online masterclass, Kings of the Rhone. I'm your host for today's event, Joe Czerwinski, managing editor of Robert Parker Wine Advocate and the taster here responsible for reviewing the wines of the Rhone Valley. Finally, after leading this class for two other time zones, it feels good to be day drinking with all of you on a sunny fall afternoon. I'm in my basement office here, just 50 miles outside of New York City. Thanks for joining in wherever you might happen to be today. Before I introduce today's guests, I need to cover a few housekeeping points. First, we have a lot of great wines to taste through in a limited amount of time. If you have enough glasses, you may want to pour the wines into separate ones so it's easy to revisit them. If not, you may want to reserve a portion within each mini bottle so you can come back to it later. Along those lines, some of you may have already noticed that your sample number 12 may have a misprinted label. The numbering is correct, and the wine inside is the 2017 Hermitage Doré, as indicated on your program and on your placemat. So don't be fooled by the misleading label. Second, to keep things moving along, we'll be holding any questions until the end of the session. You can type them into the chat at any time, and our production team will relay them to us. We'll answer as many as we can. So, without further ado, I'll introduce today's guests, Michel Chapoutier and Philippe Guigal. Both are the proprietors and winemakers at their individual companies. Michel, we'll start with you. Tell us a little bit about your family history in the Rhone and what you're doing today.
So the winery Chapoutier is based in Hermitage. It is an old family company, uh, created in 1808, but it was not our family on this time. It was the Calvé family who moved after to Bordeaux. And personally, I had the opportunity to buy this winery from my grandfather in 1990, and I changed the style. I was quite influenced because I used to be a little in California when I was young, with the Grace family vineyards. And when I arrived, I wanted to work with the notion of terroir, and the idea in the philosophy was to make very early biodynamic wines to not to try to make the best wine as possible, but the best pictures of the terroir. I was not too
That's great. Thanks, Michel. Uh, Philippe, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your company? Maybe not quite as old a history, but certainly a very young and dynamic firm now known worldwide.
Yes, thank you, Joe. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Philippe, and I represent the third generation of owner and winemaker at Guigal. The Guigal winery has been founded by my grandfather Etienne, the 1st of January 1946. And as you said, Joe, we are a young company compared to most French wineries, generally speaking. I used to say that we have always counterbalanced our youth by a strong dynamism. So I have great examples through my grandfather, Etienne, who has dedicated his whole life to winemaking, 67 vintages in his life, and my dad, Marcel. I'm very proud to work every day with my dad, who celebrated his 62nd vintage this year. So I would say both characters are a very important inspiration to me. We're located in Ampuis, which is the heart, the center of Côte-Rôtie, being the northern vineyard of the entire Rhone Valley. We have 75 hectares of land in northern Rhone through Côte-Rôtie, Condrieu, Hermitage, Saint-Joseph and Crozes-Hermitage. And we also have a great property in southern Rhone in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, 77 hectares for the Château de Nalise.
Great, thanks. We're actually going to start wine number one is one of the Guigal family's wines, Philippe's wines. It's a lovely example from the northern Rhone, where both of these companies are based. Wine number 1 is Guigal's 2019 Condrieu La Doriane. It's 100% Viognier. That's the only grape allowed within the appellation. And it's grown on some pretty steep slopes. And that really helps with getting the sunlight onto the grapes and the vines converting the sunlight into sugar. And as you can tell from nosing the wine, it's quite an expressive wine. It's floral, it's fresh, it's got some tropical fruit aromas as well. And yeah, it's quite something. Mine was a little closed, a little quiet when I poured it into the glass a few minutes ago, but now it's really emerged from that. And wow, it's just a great way to start a tasting. And Philippe, why don't you tell us a little bit more about the wine?
Well, thank you, Joe. The Condrieu La Doriane is a very special wine to us. And if I had to talk about the wine, generally speaking, in one sentence, I would simply say that La Doriane is the selection of our best estate vineyards within the Condrieu appellation. So this is very simple. We're fortunate to have about 13 hectares of Condrieu, and we are cherry picking the very best terroirs to produce La Doriane every year. So you have a great view here of the Rhone Valley, south and north, a focus in the northern part that you can see right now. And northern north, I would say, are Saint-Joseph, Condrieu, and Côte-Rôtie. Condrieu being the yellow gold color. And when you zoom to Condrieu, you can see the different sites that we use for the Condrieu La Doriane. So regarding the first site that is shown here, we are in a little bit southern in Malval and Saint-Pierre-de-Bœuf, and this is the Volant, Château de Volant spots. We are talking about granite with iron oxide on this specific place. A little bit northern here, you find the famous Colombier next to Château Gruyère, granite as well. A little bit northern would be the Coteau de Chéry. The Coteau de Chéry is a famous spot of Condrieu. You've just seen right now the Côte Châtillon, and this is going to finish with the Coteau de Vernon. The Coteau de Vernon is another magical name of Condrieu. So we are cherry picking these places. The wines are all picked separately, vinified separately. They age for about 9 months in New York. It's very interesting to see that this wine has been vinified and aged in New York, but it kept a very good balance. And the word balance is the key word for a Condrieu, or I would say a Viognier in general. As you can imagine, Viognier is a grape that is fascinating to me, and I have many opportunity to taste Viogniers from all around the world. The key word is truly the balance. It's very easy to get the typical aromas of a Viognier. It's much more difficult to balance the richness, the fatness, and let's say the weight, the natural weight of a Viognier with something else. In this case, the granites are helping a lot. It's giving an interesting balance. It's giving, let's say, some freshness, some minerality to the wine. And of course, the oak is there to balance this as well.
Yeah, for me, the fascinating aspect of this wine, Philippe, is just what you said, the balance. Because underripe Viognier, if anyone's ever tasted it, it can be pretty inexpressive and in fact sometimes downright nasty and bitter. Whereas, like you said, it's quite easy to get it overripe and get sort of these massive, weighty apricot and tropical fruit wines that lack backbone. And I think here you've really found what you've been looking for. Yeah, just a lovely wine to start the tasting.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to move on to wine number 2 now. Right, that's from our second guest, Michel Chapoutier. It's the Hermitage Chante-Alouette. It's a blend of different parcels across the Hermitage appellation. And of course, it's an entirely different grape variety. This is Marsanne. It's also barrel fermented and aged in wood. But as you can see, it's a very different sort of wine. It's a wine that's more, I guess, tighter, more structured, more focused. And you can just sort of tell that it needs time to really blossom and express itself a little bit more. Uh, for me, I usually tell people to drink Hermitage either really young, right when it's released, or really old, probably at least 10, but probably better 15 years or more after the vintage. Michel, why do you think that is? Why does Marsanne behave this way, particularly when grown in Hermitage?
So it's interesting because it is a grape with a potential of aging, which is not coming from the acidity like a Chenin Blanc or Riesling, but that's coming from the richness and the noble bitterness. That's interesting because when we taste a wine like that, the signature of the Marsanne is at the end of the tongue, the touch of bitterness. And that's probably like a tannin which gives the potential of aging. So that's mean that when your wine is young, you are on the fruit. Then it is interesting to know that very often you have like a teenager age, stupid age, that around between 5 to 10 years to 12 years, the wine is sometimes more difficult to taste. Like the green almond can become a little dominant before to be a grilled almond. And uh, and you're right. So, or you taste a white Hermitage the 5, 6 first years, or then you forget 5 more years or 7 more years to start to have the tertiary aromas. Um, and what is interesting also is that we are in a blending here, also like the philosophy of the Doriane, because for us we are not happy to do blending, but we wanted to keep some traditional blending or selection because it was the tradition in Hermitage. In Chante-Alouette, you have the vineyards which are in Chante-Alouette, but you have also the bottom vineyard of Le Méal and the bottom vineyards of Les Murets, and also some touch of Bessard in the granite part, but very little. And that's make this section make the Chante-Alouette.
Yeah, I mean it's a fantastic, for me, a fantastic example of what can be achieved by blending the different parts of Hermitage, and we'll get into, I guess, more expressions of single parcels later on in the tasting. But it's worth pointing out that traditionally Hermitage was blended, I suppose, different parcels, and you've largely taken that in other directions in some of the other wines. Uh, for me, this really stands out as being, yeah, really powerful and intense, but focused and with great length, and that to me shows that longevity, that potential for age worthiness that we're talking about.
Yeah, we can find some white Hermitage of 100 years, which are still extremely interesting. So that's fascinating.
All right, I'll put that on my bucket list. That's great. We're going to move on now to wine number three, and we thought we'd change things up a little bit. We've got a mystery wine for you. We've got a mystery wine from each of the producers. This one is from Guigal, wine number three. Uh, if you compare the color of that wine to the color of the wine next to it, wine number five, you can see that the color is uh, slightly different. It's maybe quite a bit less vibrant purple in color, more of a subdued red into garnet, and it's a really interesting contrast when you compare it to some of the other wines. Uh, yeah, I mean it's got a beautiful aromas of, for me, a little bit of rose, some cherries, maybe some sandalwood because there is some oak in this wine. And when you taste it, when you get it in the mouth, you get this wonderful, sort of silky, enveloping character of the tannins in the wine. Uh, if you're interested in taking a guess, please feel free to put your guesses in the chat so that you're on record as having guessed the wine correctly or incorrectly, as the case may be, because we're going to reveal the wine shortly, and we'll bring Philippe on to let you guys know what the wine is and why he's so excited about it. Because this to me is a really lovely wine. Philippe, counting down to you, sort of 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Philippe.
So there we are, thinking of such a tasting for you today, and drinking Northern Rhone wines only would have been a little bit sad. So we all thought, Joe, Michel, and I, that we should show a little bit of the Southern Rhone, and we've chosen the best appellation, and we're tasting a Chateauneuf du Pape. The Chateauneuf du Pape you're tasting right now is from the Chateau de Nalys, a property that we acquired in 2017. And let me tell you a few words about what Nalys is today. Nalys is located in the very heart of Chateauneuf du Pape. It is a property of 77 hectares today, with 3 major terroirs that are next to each other, but very fortunately very different with each other. First of all, the terroir surrounding Nalys, surrounding the property, is made of Grès Rouge du Comtat and Safre. Grès Rouge du Comtat is an interesting mix of, let's say, sand and clay, reddish color, and the Safre make that the wine produced from this sector are extremely elegant, extremely delicate wines. We have another plot which is coming from the most renowned place in Chateauneuf du Pape. I'm talking about Lacros. And Lacros is this fantastic sector where you have these big pebbles that are very typical of the Chateauneuf du Pape appellation. The terroir of Lacros is a great terroir. It can be a little bit dry because the layer of clay is quite deep. The continuation of Lacros is another sector named Le Bois Sénéchal. Nalys owns a significant part of the Bois Sénéchal. And you find exactly the same pebbles you have in Lacros, except that the clay is just a little bit underneath, not very deep. It's also a place that does not suffer from drought, which is a key point for Chateauneuf du Pape because of the global warming and also with the warm vintages. So Nalys is the combination of these 3 terroirs. Back to the Chateau de Nalys 2016, you have a great expression of a powerful Chateauneuf du Pape. This is our style of Chateauneuf du Pape, with a majority of Grenache, of course, about 50%. But what's very significant is 1/3 of Syrah. The Syrah is helping with the density, it's helping with the tannins as well. We have a significant touch of Mourvèdre as well. And Nalys is one of the few properties in Chateauneuf du Pape that carry the famous 13 different grapes of Chateauneuf du Pape. So don't ask me to name the precise percentages of Counoise, Terre Noire, or Muscardin. But yes, they are in this blend. And I think these secondary or tertiary grapes will have an interesting complexity in the final wine. Very important, it's 2016. We have not vinified this wine. We've taken care of the aging and we've chosen the barrels, the vats to make this Grand Vin, the Chateau de Nalys 2016. So yes, I am very much looking forward for you to discover the next vintages, 17, 18, 19, and maybe Joe can tell us a little bit about the next vintages because you have tasted them, Joe, right?
Yes, but we're not giving that away here on the show. People will have to check the website and look for my reviews there. One of the interesting things about 2016 is, for me, it's one of the greatest vintages that I've had the privilege of tasting in the Southern Rhone, and specifically in Chateauneuf du Pape. I think, for me, it's up there with probably 2010, 2001, 1998, 1990. It's in that category of really superlative years. Philippe, is that how you see 16 down there?
Yes, 16 is 2000 is definitely an outstanding vintage in Southern Rhone. So I very much enjoy the 2016. It's also the reason why we've chosen to show this wine under the Guigal label. It's not vinified by us once again, but I totally embrace, let's say, this quality.
Great. We're going to move on to Michel's mystery wine. That's wine number 4. Again, trying not to give too much away, but the wines are in sort of pairs, I suppose, as we move through the lineup. So it's another mystery wine. It's another wine that doesn't show the vibrant sort of dark purple of some of the other wines. And when you swirl it around, you can see that it does have substantial glycerol, which is usually associated with high alcohol content. One thing I will say is that in the past couple seminars, we've had some variation in this wine, and some of the samples that people are getting are maybe not 100% what they should be. It seems very sensitive to oxidation in the rebottling process, but please try to bear with us as we taste along through it. Even with that sort of less than perfect condition, you can still tell it's really ripe and round in the mouth. Has this great sort of licorice aftertaste to it, and yeah, it's still an outstanding wine, even when it's slightly off. That's pretty impressive. Michel, you want to tell us what the mystery wine number 4 is?
So yes, it's also 2016 and also a Château de Pape, but it is the Lieu-dit Croix de Bois with 100% Grenache. Just what I wanted to say, we could see in the other tasting and here also that the transfer from one bottle to small bottles hurted the wine, hurted quite severely the wine. For two reasons, I think. At first, the Grenache is sensitive with oxidation, and it is for this reason that very often the Grenache was blended with Syrah. But it is interesting to taste some 100% Grenache, like Rayas did, and normally, if it's correctly done, the Grenache don't go through oxidation. But because all our wines from our estates are in biodynamic culture, with the Demeter label, that means that to have this the certification, we need to have some extremely low total sulfates and free sulfates. And it is for that the exercise to open a bottle to retransfer, that the wine suffer more. And so it's for that you will see that also on the 2 Côte-Rôtie we present later, they are not exactly what we find in the original bottle because of this oxidation. But here, the oxidation is much more important in this wine. And it's interesting because I would say we have the characteristic of a Grenache that the people of the generation of my grandfather liked very much. And not because they like this rancio, this little touch of rancio. When I bought the winery, even some Châteauneuf du Pape used to be aged in chestnut barrel, and they had this signature of evolutive wine. So for this reason, we ferment this wine in a concrete tank, and after we age it not in barrel but in concrete tank, in brut, no, with no protection inside. So you have the brittle concrete because that's permit in the concrete. The granularity keeps some oxygen, and you have like an evolution, like an élevage, like you have the same level of oxygen in the élevage, or not as much as the barrel élevage. But so that's the Croix de Bois. What I wanted to say on the soil, le lieu-dit Lieu-dit Croix-de-Bois is on the highway, and the A7. And we see here also there is pebbles, and it's interesting because you have pebbles. The pebbles are interesting because when you watch them, the shape of pebble is like a hat of a mushroom, and it is important because that means when you have rain, the rain go on the pebble, go under, and when this water won't try to evaporate because of the warm weather, under the pebble it's like a mushroom, so that's keep the humidity. And it's for that that's when we want to plow or to work the soil, it's extremely important to understand that we can't plow the pebbles like we plow a normal soil. When we plow a normal soil, we turn the earth. But when we will work here, we will just move the pebbles, but never make them, you know, on the other side, Because if you put the pebble in the other side, then the rain arrive here and can't go down. So it's interesting. I defend always this notion of Grenache because we have the great like Philippe said, we can play with 13 grapes varietal in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and the appellation Châteauneuf-du-Pape has some rules which are uh, extremely soft. That means you could do a Counoise 100%, or you could do a Syrah 100%. Nothing oblige you like in other appellation, and I think it's very clever. It's very clever because you have some time in appellation. I think of Languedoc-Roussillon, where you are obliged to blend the Grenache with the Syrah, and sometimes the Grenache are so amazing that you don't help the wine to do the blending. So this freedom about the choice of cepage and the proportion of grape varietals is extremely interesting in Châteauneuf-du-Pape.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's you're allowed any of these 13, some people say 18 varieties because they're counting different color mutations of the grape varieties as being separate. But there's ultimate flexibility in Chateauneuf. Uh, any one of those varieties can be alone or in any proportion in a blend with any of the others. And yeah, this to me is a nice example of the Grenache, Michel. Despite a little bit of oxidation in my glass, it really looks good, and it
But
shows
the
the
bubble,
sort of the texture that Grenache is really capable of. That silkiness, that being mouth filling and rich without being overly weighty. So, congrats to you on that. I hope a lot of you got at least the second mystery wine correct, right? I mean, we practically handed it to you, didn't we? We're going to move on. Yeah, we're about 30 minutes in, and we're on to wine number 5. So I think our timing is good this time around, guys, and hopefully we won't keep people around for too many, too long. Wine number 5. You know what a difference after wines 3 and 4, right? It's got that dark sort of Syrah, northern Rhone Syrah color. Beautiful floral aromatics. And just tremendous balance, length, elegance on the palate. Um, yeah, no, I mean, for me, this wine, the La Mouline, from a single parcel in Côte-Rôtie, it's always the most elegant of Guigal Lalas. And I guess part of that is probably due to the inclusion of Viognier in the blend. There's quite a bit of Viognier planted here, uh, but also has a lot to do with the exposition. And Philippe, can you tell us more about La Mouline and where it's situated in Côte-Rôtie and why it always is among the most elegant expressions of Côte-Rôtie that you make?
With great pleasure. Talking about La Mouline is talking about Côte-Rôtie. So first of all, Côte-Rôtie stays a small appellation. We're talking about 320 hectares more or less. And two significant sectors in Côte-Rôtie. The southern part, often described as the Blanc part, and the northern part as the Brune part. Interestingly, on the southern part, you find the schists that are very typical of Côte-Rôtie, but a lot of limestone and silica on the surface. And all winemakers know that Syrah growing on limestone is always elegant and delicate. So the wines from the southern part, as you said, it's the case of La Mouline, are delicate and elegant. The northern part, you find some clay in the soil, you find some iron oxide, you find some manganese. That is to say, you find elements that are giving extra phenolics to the wines, maybe more anthocyanins, more color, definitely more tannins, more structure. La Mouline, as you can see on this animation, is located in the very heart of the Côte Blonde. So it is coming from a historical vineyard. La Mouline is probably the oldest vines of Côte-Rôtie. That is to say, we have an average age of the vines of 90 years old, and we still find vines dating back 1893. 1893 is the very first replantations after the Felix crisis in Côte-Rôtie. So we're talking about grafted Syrah on American rootstocks, but it's probably the oldest in Côte-Rôtie. Very important in the expression of this wine is the shape of the vineyards. When you look at the Côte-Rôtie La Mouline from the sky, you see a vineyard that has the shape of a Roman amphitheater, so a curved shape like this, which is very interesting because in terms of exposure, you have parts of La Mouline facing south, other parts facing east, and you have this, let's say, this spectrum of different exposures that are very interesting. You mentioned the Viognier, which is very significant here. By law, if I can say, in Côte-Rôtie, you can use up to 20% Viognier, and La Mouline carries 11%. It's a fill blend, so it's not a decision from the winemaker to say, I'm going to place 11% Viognier in La Mouline. It's just planted there for a very long time. It's very old vines, as I told you. And we're very happy to have the Viognier co-planted with the Syrah. We think it brings a lot of complexity. We easily guess the aromatic impact of the Viognier in the wine, but I am very, very much convinced in the textural impact of the Viognier in the finished wines. A sad news, La Mouline is a tiny vineyard of 1 hectare. So in a normal vintage, we produce more or less 5,000 bottles of La Mouline. And one word about the vintage, 2016. I think 2016 is a great vintage in Côte-Rôtie. And you have a good example here, simply because it's a vintage that has been forgotten. The vintage before is 2015. It's a big vintage, no doubt. I love the 15. We'll see examples of 15s today, but 16 has been a little bit forgotten. And it's a bit sad because this vintage shows a lot of balance. Once again, what I love about this wine is that the fruits, the tannins, everything is at the right spot, at the right place. And it's a wine that speaks extremely well. All these components speak extremely well to each other. And I would love someone who's never tried a Côte-Rôtie to start with the 16 vintage, because I think it's very typical of the balance and the elegance we can have in Côte-Rôties.
No, I think for me, one of the nice things about 16 in the northern Rhone is that there's a certain harmony running through the wines, and I don't see them. Probably this is partly guesswork, right? I don't see them closing down the way some of the bigger, more structured vintages do. For example, we're not showing your 15 Lalas in this tasting for a reason, right? I mean, those are big wines that, in my experience anyway, they've closed down quite a bit since release. and they probably need another, gosh, 7 years, 10 years to really come
At
back
least.
and show really what they're made of. Yeah, at least. But so I'd always rather tell people to drink the wine a little young than too old. But yeah, it's hard to go wrong with the so-called rule of 15 for these sorts of wines, where you want to wait 15 years from the vintage.
Absolutely. It's important to be patient with big Rhone wines.
Thanks, Philippe. We're going to move to Michel Chaputier's Côte-Rôtie La Mordoréee, also from 2016, and from pretty similar location within Côte-Rôtie, but this one is not from a single plot. It's from two different lieux-dits that Michel has chosen to blend into La Mordoréee. So you heard Philippe talk about Côte Brune and Côte Blonde in the sense that they're sort of distinct portions of the appellation. Uh, but in fact, each of those names, La Côte Brune and La Côte Blonde, uh, also represent specific lieux-dits within the appellation. And they actually sort of butt up against each other, divided by a small little ravine. And La Mordoréee is a blend of those two parcels that Chapoutier owns. So, Michel, why La Mordoréee? How did it get that name? And how long have you guys been producing it? It seems like it's been around. I don't want to say forever, but certainly
Yeah.
forever in my terms.
No, I think it was the name that my grandfather gave, So it's something probably at the time of a little before the war that he was using this name. Uh, the Mordoréee mean because woodcock, the bird.
Yes.
I think because
Hmm.
my grandfather was a hunter, and he always said that we have a French course which is la rôtie de Bécasse. So it's like a pâté from the Bécasse, and he was always telling that the best wine for the rôtie de Bécasse was the Côte-Rôtie, and he was from Hermitage, but he was telling that it with the rôtie de Bécasse it was a Côte-Rôtie which was important to take, and probably for this reason he gave the name of La Mordoréee.
Great. So tell us a little bit more about the wine and how you make it and where
Yeah.
it comes from. And
So it's a so here with the difference we are 100% Syrah. I think we have quite no maybe few vines of Viognier, but it's quite only Syrah. This bottle also has suffered because I have the two bottles. Has suffered a little by the transfer because we have a signature which is a little chocolate nose, chocolate cabosse, and that
Mhm.
I don't have in the normal bottle. So it's fermented in a small tank, a country tank of 40 and 60 hectoliters. The idea is to let the temperature go up because we work uh, like Philippe also, we work only with wild yeast. That's a very important point because if we want to have pictures of the terroir, it is important to work with the yeast of the place. If you take a selected yeast, very often the selected yeast will take the power on the wild yeast and you will not have the total signature of the place. So the print of the place come also from the population of wild yeast. So then to work with this wild yeast, where you have plenty of differences of races, of expression, I like to say that a wine is a aromatic symphony, and you could compare the yeast to the musical instrument in a symphonic orchestra. And the idea is to have a temperature which will go quite high. When I say quite high, I will speak in Celsius, sorry. We go to 30, 32, because which is, I don't know what. Uh, Maybe Philip, you can help me. I don't know. uh, I would say that what 90, well,
For
something
the
like that.
Fahrenheit,
Yeah,
30, 90, a little under 90 degrees Fahrenheit.
And that's important because we want to create the length of the wine, and we don't want to waste because the fermentation creates warm, and we don't want to waste warm by cooling down. So the good shape of the concrete tank is that all the calories are stored in the concrete, and after the fermentation the calories are given back, because if the temperature of the mass go down too quickly, we will have a vegetal taste. But the idea is to have a good polymerization, is to have 4 to 6 weeks of skin contact. And we don't extract more by a long skin contact. I will say we extract less, because by the exchange after the fermentation, the maximum of extraction in the test is after 4 or 5 days, because you have the very aggressive tannin. The deep tannin of the skins are extracted at the end of the fermentation, but then you will wait after on the mast, and that's what the idea we want to develop, is to have the silkiness in the tannins. And also by this selection, by osmosis, some tannins, the first extracted tannins, will go back to the skin after the fermentation. And it is for that also we don't use the free run wine that will be used to make the Fino de Vie of Côte-Rôtie, the brandy of Côte-Rôtie, that's the distillation of the press wine. And so after we put that in barrel, and we age the wine in a oak barrel during 18 months, we don't have 100% new barrel. We work around, for our Syrah, around 25 to 30%. The problem was I wanted to bring down the percentage of new wood because of the level of alcohol, which is higher. Alcohol is a solvent, so we were extracting more of the sap of the wood. And so the problem was for us, because we age 18 months. It's true that when you age 40 or 42 months like Philippe, you don't have this problem because you have a longer exchange. But with 18 months, it was important to readapt and to bring down the percentage of new barrel.
Yeah, that's a good point because one of the interesting things about both of those comments about extending the maceration and extending the élevage is that, in fact, as you pointed out, the the strength of the tannin or the perception of the tannin is greatest after a relatively short period of time, and then with longer time on the skins, it becomes less. And I would say the same thing is true in the barrel. Most wines that I taste from barrel, the oak is most prominent, somewhere between 10 and 14 months of aging. And then beyond that, the oak signature tends to become less. And
Exactly.
yeah, that's really significant when we look at the next wine, wine number 7, uh, from Philippe, because these Lalas from Guigal spend an impressive amount of time in barrel. And of course, it's 100% new oak. And people hear things like, "Oh, Guigal spends 40 months, 42 months in new oak. It must be horrifically oaky." And in fact, while they could be oaky, and the oak is certainly a component of the wine, I don't find it to be in excess by any stretch. I mean, there's plenty of material in the wine to support it. And in fact, if you taste the wine as I do, I'll taste 3 or 4 vintages of the Lalas uh, at one time when I'm with Philippe, and you can see the wines are, yes, after 1 year from the vintage, they're reasonably oaky, but the oak influence diminishes over time, and that continues, I think, in the bottle. By the time the wines are 15 years past the vintage, you're not going to see nearly as much oak influence as you do when the wines are released, or when the wines are tasted prior to bottling, even. Uh, Philippe, you want to talk a little bit more about the oak on your cocotiers and why it's an important part of your philosophy at Guigal?
Yes, oak is something important in the figures because you probably noticed that I forgot to mention that La Mouline spent 40 months or 42 months in New York barrels. The reason why I forgot this is that it's not a key element for me in the final expression of the wines. On the paper, I truly agree with you. When I read 40 or 42 months, I say to myself, wow, that's a lot of New York. But I'm not here to read the technical notes. I'm here to taste the wines. And when I taste the wines, I have a very different feeling. So Michel talked about, the long vatting time. And vatting time, it's completely true, it is a way to, let's say, do an interesting work on the tannins. The reason why we aged the wines so long in your barrels is also because of the work we want to do on the tannins. That is to say, when I talk about 40 months, a lot of people hear New York equals vanilla, equals vanilline. That is to say, the typical oak flavors in the wine. I do feel them, but it's not my major interest. My major interest is the polymerization of the tannins. I think that by waiting longer than usual, you have a very interesting work on the quality of the tannins. The fact that we age longer doesn't change the quantity of tannins, but it does change the quality of the tannins. And you have, I think, this very interesting touch, this velvety touch linked to the long time oak aging. So I truly agree to say that on the first years, you find oak flavors. Interestingly, La Turque 2017 has been bottled last February. So it's the current vintage, and the last release, the 2018s, will be bottled next February 2022. And what I love about this wine is that 2017 is a warm vintage. It shows the signature of the vintage is important in this wine. It was a generous vintage. And I think, the work that has been done with the long-term oak aging did not open too much the wine. It kept, I would say, a good frame to the wine, a good balance, once again. We have a little bit less Viognier here than in La Mouline. We have 7% Viognier in La Turque. And interestingly, the vineyard is slightly younger than La Mouline. La Mouline, I mentioned extremely old vines. La Turque has been replanted in the beginning of the 80s. So let's say we have less old vines, but the terroir is so special here that, despite the youth of the vines, you have a true expression of this sector. This sector with schist, once again, but with a lot of iron oxide. The iron oxide is here, let's say, to show the natural concentration and the energy that you have in this wine. There is no specific process during the vinification outside pumping over, and also pigeage. So we would push the cap down twice a day during the vinification, and this is it. It is true that the vatting time is quite long, between 3 and 4 weeks for this vintage. But once again, the oak came, and it's like it's placing all these elements tied together in a good shape. So the vintage 17 is generous. The wine is, I think, singing today. It's showing extremely well, but it's also a wine that has been made to age. So I very much believe in the good potential of aging for this wine.
Yeah, I mean, it's always expressive, La Turque. I think it's for me, it's a sort of a signature of the parcel, is that you just put your nose in it and it blows your hair back. Yeah. Wow. Okay. So that was La Turque. Quite an experience. I'm going to move on to wine number 8. That's from Michel Chapoutier. Same vintage, 2017. Côte-Rôtie and the Ludi of this particular wine is Neve. Neve is a Côte-Brune vineyard. So it's actually if you travel to Ampuy, you sort of most people get off the highway, you follow some spaghetti strand exit ramps around, and you find yourself on a traversing a dam, which you can see on the map to the left there. You traverse this dam across the Rhone, and almost immediately in front of the dam is this quarry. And just to the right side of the quarry, up at the top of the hill, is Neve. So it's parts of the vineyard are steep, parts of it are sort of flat up on the top part of the slope, and it's not a lieu-dit that probably has gained a lot of fame up until now. There's just been a couple producers putting it on their label. And Michel, tell us a little bit about discovering Neve, if you will, and what makes it a special parcel.
That's again a part. It was not planted for a long time, and my grandfather. But there is two places that my grandfather pushed me to buy as land unplanted. That was Neve in Côte-Rôtie, and it was Le Clos in Saint-Joseph. Le Clos in Saint-Joseph is just in Tournon. And these two places, my grandfather was telling that used to be extraordinary vineyard, and which was not replanted after probably since the war, and it was a huge work to plant this. That's interesting to see how the Mikashis can have this expression, and here also I suffer a little by the comparison of the glass with the evolution, but it's interesting to see the signature of the Côte-Rôtie, which is like on the Mikashist, the black olive on the which is on the pizza, let's say, if you want, and like we have also the bacon. Because of the time I start to be hungry, so it's easy for me to find this sort of marriage, and
You did already? You didn't have dinner before coming online?
no. I prefer to have the dinner after. And that's interesting because in a lot of places I've bought vineyards which were in place. That means it is like I discover to start from the beginning to take a whole vineyard where the walls has disappeared, where you had to take off all the trees, and you realize that the huge job and the cost to plant 1 hectare when you have to do, because you make walls with we say dry stone wall. That means there is no concrete between, no cement between the stones. It's an art to do that. But it is interesting because also these walls in the past were keeping the warm, and that was permitting sometimes the wine to have a better maturity. So Mikashist has not I would say the quality, has not the lack of the granite, because the granite had the quartz, which was with the light, was permitting to have a higher percentage of sugar, and it was very important in the past. Probably that now with the global warming, what was the quality in Saint Joseph with the granite could become sometime a problem, because we will have and we will have sometimes too much sugar in the juice. And what was probably the Mikashis, which has not the quality of the granite with the quartz, finally that's become slowly a quality, because that's will permit the wine to not be too high in percentage of alcohol.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this wine is very much about structure. I mean, it's tannic, but it has a essential sort of softness to those tannins that I think will enable it to age, a good long time. And I guess, are those tannins, you think, unique to the particular site, or is it related more to what we talked about before with the vinification?
I think that's interesting because the tannins are very, for me, it's the quality of the clay which will make the tannins. There is two things that we will watch. That is the percentage of clay, but also the internal surface of clay. And that's always on schist. If you take schist, mica schist, if you take granite, gneiss, we have always some interesting clay because the clay is coming by the decomposition of the stone also. By opposition of everything you will find in the south, where you have some clay which are coming from the limestone. And one of the strong point of the north of the Rhone Valley is that we have some clay, some quality of clay that we will have difficulty to find this in the south, in the south of the Rhone Valley on the sediment soil.
Cool. So it's about the soil in essence, huh?
That's the soil. It's interesting, and because if you want to have a signature of the soil, we don't want to be too chauvinistic, but I think there is not a lot of wine region where when you change appellation, you have a dominant taste, which is so obvious. Um, we will have the signature of the Syrah in Côte-Rôtie. You find that easily in the blind tasting. When you arrive in Cornas, you will have like the fig trees leaves. When you arrive in Hermitage, you will have the ink, the tar, and each time you change, with the same grape, you have a completely different expression. And I think it's difficult to have these difference so obvious in other region. It is probably in our region. I will explain that our region is the best wine region. Everybody say that. Everybody say that. But the difference for us, it is true. That's all.
It's certainly a lot of fun to taste through the different appellations. I'll
Yeah,
grant you
yeah.
that. And yeah, the Syrah is a variety that I think doesn't get enough credit for transmitting terroir. People talk about Pinot Noir or Riesling as being these fabulous lenses to see terroir. But I think you're right that when you travel through the northern Rhone and you taste Syrah from Côte-Rôtie and you taste Syrah from Cornas and Ermitage, uh, yeah, it's different in each place.
I think also that we have a strong culture in our region of wild yeast. Of course, we some yeast have been proposed as selected yeast from the place. But even when you
Hmm.
take selected yeast from the place, these selected yeast, when they will go back to the juice and start to work, they will always batter the wild yeast balance. And thank happily, we don't have a culture of selected yeast in the Rhone Valley.
Ah, great. We're going to see some more of those differences now in terroir as we move to wine number 9, which is the Guigal's 2015 Ex Voto. Now, Guigal, as Philippe mentioned, is located, headquartered in Ampuis, which is Côte-Rôtie, and of course they're one of the biggest landowners there, and in Condrieu. Uh, in Ermitage, they have relatively small holdings, and Philippe will tell you more about that. But first, let's take a look at the wine, the 2015. Now, we mentioned 2015 as being a big vintage, a powerful vintage, and I think that's pretty clear when you taste this wine. You know, it's it's a big wine, and it has some of those inky, tarry characters that Michel was talking about. For me, it always has some sort of like roasted meat quality to it, and yeah, just big, broad-shouldered, pretty muscular, and clearly that style fits in with the Guigal philosophy of long aging in barrel prior to release. Philippe, you want to tell us a little bit about where this wine is coming from in Hermitage and maybe the history of the small holdings that you have there?
Absolutely. Well, as you mentioned it, we are very humble owners in Hermitage. So we own more or less 4 hectares of land in Hermitage. Very fortunately, the sectors where we're in are interesting sectors. So the red ex-Voto you're tasting right now is coming from Les Greffieux, just below Les Méales. It's also coming from what I would name Les Bessards. It's technically speaking on the Hermite lieu-dit, but it's more a Bessard-like expression of the Hermite. These 2 vineyards represent 40% of the blends. We have 10% coming from l'Hermite on the top, as well as 10% coming from Les Murets, but the hillside of Les Murets, not the flat part of Les Murets, which is interesting for the reds. Hermitage is for me a magnificent vineyard, a very complex appellation. You notice that it took me 2 minutes to talk about the 2 different terroirs of Côte-Rôtie, Côte Blonde parts and the Brune parts. In Hermitage, it could take 1 hour. You have a fantastic complexity in the soils. The soils are changing extremely quickly from one place to another. So then you have the philosophy that you want to show in an Hermitage. And I like to say, without talking about my personal case, that we see 2 different philosophies within the vineyard of Hermitage. We see the philosophy of Michel, and he will speak for himself. Excellent idea to say, I want to show a picture of the terroir. So I want to show Le Pavillon as a very precise expression of what is the soil and the microclimate, etc., the terroir of Le Pavillon. This is one way of thinking. Another way of thinking is the Chave philosophy, considering that the different terroirs are so specific in Hermitage that to have a clear picture of Hermitage, we should do a blend of the different terroirs in Hermitage. I, of course, respect both. This is obviously, with the ex-Voto, a blend of different terroirs. I think they are combining with each other extremely well, so they are totally complementary. Back to the vintage 2015, no doubt it's a big vintage, but for me it's very strange to taste this wine right now because I think it's a baby. It's wine that has a fantastic future. The aging is interesting because once again we have had a long aging of 40 months, and the oak is starting to melt in the wine in a very interesting way. It's quite difficult today to say this is more the oak than the tannins. Interestingly, when I taste a wine like this following Côte-Rôties, I am able to taste the 50 kilometers south difference that you can have between Côte-Rôtie and Hermitage. So this is for me extremely typical, and yes, it's a wine I think that has a bright future. It's from a fantastic vintage. We might open it a little bit early today, but it shows the complexity. It shows the diversity of the terroirs that you can find in the Hermitage appellation.
Yeah, that's a really good point you make about Hermitage and the question of whether a reflection of Hermitage needs to be a blend or whether it can be an expression of a single part of Hermitage. A few years back when I did a tasting at the 50th anniversary of the Hermitage appellation. We did a selection of wines tasted across the appellation from different specific parts of the hill, and you could really see a difference in the wines, the Syrah expression, as you went from in the east on more, I guess, sort of softer, more clay, more fertile soils, and then across to Les Bessards, which of course is quite steep and very granitic. And yeah, I think what we often miss is that when we talk about terroir, you can talk about looking at it through different sort of lenses. We can look at terroir of a specific little parcel, We can look at terroir of an appellation. We can look at terroir of a region. I mean, Northern Rhone Syrah has a regional expression that I think reflects its sort of macro terroir, if you will, of the Northern Rhone. And then you can zero into an appellation like Hermitage or Cornas, and then we can go further down into that to the individual parcel. And of course, that's what Michel is talking about in a lot of his parcellaire wines. And that's where we're going to go next to wine number 10, which is the Chapoutier Hermitage Le Pavillon. This is a wine that I absolutely loved when I tasted it upon release. And I still think it shows enormous, enormous potential. Wow, look at those tannins, the length, that sort of richness combined with not excessive weight. Michel, tell us where exactly Le Pavillon comes from and what makes it so special amongst the lineup of the parcellaire wines that you produce.
The Pavillon is on Bessart, on the granitic part of Hermitage. When you watch the Hermitage, the the left the west part of the Hermitage is the granitic part from the primary period. And what is interesting is after you move slowly, you pass through the sediment, and where you have, because you are at the cross point between the Central Massif, Pre-Alps Massif, and the Rhone sediment and the glacier sediment. And it's true, Hermitage is a patchwork. Uh, Here, the idea was to show the expression of the pure granite. And it's interesting because Tain is with a twin city or village, which is called Tournon. And the famous granite is the granite of Tournon. We have in Hermitage the granite of Tournon, where the quartz portion of the granite are extremely important. So the pavillon is a lieu-dit, which is not a lieu-dit. Pavillon used to be a lieu-dit on the Complan, which was the ancestor of the cadastre that was at the time of Louis XIV. And we recreated this lieu-dit, this past lieu-dit, and the first time I did a pavillon from this place was in '89. In the past, when my grandfather was doing the pavillon, he was doing a wine which was a blending of different. So when you find some old pavillon before '89, they are not from a single vineyard. And it was my first single vineyard. And the idea was to show that if every year you have the soil which is exactly the same, then you let a certain power to the climate, that's mean to the vintage, to express. And when you compare, my idea was also to compare from the granite, for instance, the Pavillon, the Méal, the Greffieux. You know, when I was in California, the discussion I had, I was friend with Andrei Chelichev, and that was the sort of discussion we had, and that was also the discussion. Was the I'm old now. That was Helen Chorley also. That was discussion with her husband John that we had about what is the expression of the terroir. Is the expression of the terroir coming from the climate, or is it coming from the soil? So Helen Jolie has perfected with John perfectly understood that the soil had something to say, but the generation of people like Andrei Chelichev, considering that the climate was very important. And the idea was to say, we want to show that each parcel can give a different taste. And it is true, Philippe is right, that the philosophy, the tradition philosophy of Hermitage was the blending of these different places, because you had the structure of the granite, you had the elegance of the greffieux, and you have the power of the méal. So it's for that that we do the scissoran. But here, what is interesting, that is to show how the granite speak by itself with the granite clay. And you have in the nose, the signature is interesting. You have for me, the tar, the the smoke of the fireplace. You have also ink. Licorice is present. So I really like the granite everywhere.
Yep. For
Sorry, I
me,
was long.
the granite, you see the granite in portions of Hermitage, you see the granite in portions of Saint Joseph, you see the granite in portions of Cornas, and it always gives a certain, for me, a sort of structural, a textural austerity to the wine. Not so much that the wines aren't generous, but it just sort of reins things in a little bit and composes it and gives it that drive, that energy, that length on the finish. That is what's exciting about these Northern Rhone Syrahs.
There is also the petrichor. You know, this I would say last, huh? This notion of petrichor, which is the smell of the summer rain on the hot stone. And each time you have granite, you can go all over. You can go in Australia when you taste the Jaconda Sierra. You have this signature also of the summer rain on the hot stone. You know, this nose of ozone, what in USA they call petrichor.
I think that's more of an Australian term, to tell you the truth, but
I
we
think
use it
it
too
was
on
American.
rare. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
I mean, in essence, it's yeah. In a technical sense, it's probably comprised of botanical oils that collect on the stones and then are released by evaporating rain or evaporating water. But it's quite interesting. And in my notes, you'll sometimes see me refer to a smell of crushed stone. Like when you get a new driveway laid and it's a gravel driveway that is laid down, and you get these sort of soft puffs of dust that come up from that. And I think it probably something similar in terms of the actual what we're smelling, so forth. Of course, this may come as a shock to some of you, or maybe not to others, but we saved white wines for the end. So we started with whites, and we're going to end with whites as well. That's because white Hermitage is a special sort of wine, and it's been recognized as such for a long time. Thomas Jefferson wrote back in 1791 that the white Hermitage is the first wine in the world, without a single exception. Uh, and at the time, Hermitage was mostly planted to white grapes. Now they make up a relatively small proportion of what's in the appellation. But there's a reason uh, for white Hermitage, and we're going to start with the 2017 Guigal Ex Voto Blanc. So again, it's a blend of a couple different Ludi on the Hermitage slope. Barrel fermented, barrel aged. I think you can detect some of that on the nose probably. There's a bit of char and smokiness to it. But really wonderfully rich and expansive on the palate. Generous, yet focused and long at the same time. It's wow, a magnificent wine. And Philippe, tell us a little bit about the Ex Voto Blanc. And I don't know, maybe because Americans might not really know what to pair with this sort of wine. It's sort of counterintuitive to what most Americans are drinking these days, which tend to be sort of leaner, crisper whites earlier in a meal. And yeah, this is something quite different, isn't it?
It is extremely different. Well, first of all, it's a brilliant idea to finish this tasting with a white Hermitage, because I think you see, let's say, the density and the weight these white wines from Hermitage can bring, can show after these big reds. This white ex Voto is coming from our estate in Hermitage, which is a small estate. We own a little bit less than 2 hectares. About 20% is from l'Ermite, and 80% is coming from Les Murets. A very interesting sector mentioned by Michel a little bit before. And we inherited these vineyards from the purchase of 2 estates that were the former Jean-Louis Grippa estate, as well as the former De Valois estate. And there's an interesting story about the vineyard of Les Murets, because first time we visited the vineyard with Jean-Louis Grippa, it was with my dad. And we arrived there, and Jean-Louis told my dad, Marcel, Philippe, this is my vineyard of Les Murets. I have to tell you that unfortunately, this vineyard has been planted in 2 different times. So half of the vineyard is young vine, and the other half is old vines. The young vine part is 60 years old, and the old vine part is a bit more than 100 years old. So very interestingly, when you taste this wine, I think you have a real density. It's a wine that shows a lot of dry extract. It's a wine that shows a lot of body. And this weight in the wine is not linked to any kind of vinification. It's directly linked, I think, to the age of the vines, which is very much significant here. The clay in Les Murets is not a species of clay that dries during the summer, so I think it keeps a good freshness. And surprisingly, the very old vines we have from Les Murets are not shriveled. You know, they're not old in the way that they're tied. They stay extremely vigorous. You know, they produce four grapes on each vine, which is far enough from what we need. And I'm very happy to have the expression of Les Murets in this wine. The aging is long. I always prefer people to taste the wine before I mention the aging, but it's a wine that is vinified and aged for 30 months in new oak. So once again, on the paper, for a white wine, 30 months is a lot. But we find a real response of the oak and the wine. You asked me about the pairing with food. And of course, you know, I've had the opportunity to do a lot of pairings through the winemakers dinner I've done in the US, I've done in Asia, in other places, and so on. It is true that they are, let's say, dishes in Asia where you can find a very interesting balance with the wine. And surprisingly, spices is a good answer to white Hermitage. You can have spices in China, of course. When you visit India, or a little bit closer to us, when you go to England, it's always a nightmare to match the curry with. And curry and white Hermitage is something that could work well, because once again, there's a strong response of the wine with the curry. Last but not least is a very French answer to your question. We have 2 national dishes in France that are the famous frogs and snails. And when we talk about frogs and snails, we talk about a lot of garlic. And garlic is always a nightmare to find something to match with. Well, believe it or not, Hermitage has the shoulders. Hermitage has the power to counterbalance the garlic. And you could have extremely good surprises matching white Hermitage with powerful dishes.
Yeah, I mean, it really demands something powerful, doesn't it? I mean, if you were to pour this with a light dish of maybe a sole or something like that, it would overpower it. I mean, and maybe that's what you want to do in some instances and show off the wine. But in terms of harmony with a dish, yeah, I think you're right. I think it needs some rich flavors to go with it. We're going to move to the last wine now. It's wine number 12. Wow, I can't believe we're through already. This is going pretty well. We're keeping on schedule, which is great. We should have plenty of time for Q&A at the end, so make sure you're typing your questions in the chat, and our production team will relay them to us. Wine number 12, Hermitage de Lorraine, 2017, from Michel Chapoutier, from a particular single parcel of Hermitage. Michel will tell us about which one. But this really takes that classic case of richness and white Hermitage to another level. Really broad and palate coating without being overly heavy. And that's, in many ways, that's the trick of Hermitage, right, Michel? Is that you have this intensity, this richness, and yet the wines don't come across as being that heavy.
You're right. It's rich. It's not heavy. Probably the bitterness. You don't feel the acidity because to have a good Hermitage, we are obliged to harvest at a good maturity. We have to wait that the grapes are quite orange, very mature. And in our ways, we have a low level of acidity, but we know since a long time that it's not the acidity which permits Hermitage to have a potential of aging. Um, that was interesting what was telling Philippe because the marriage of Hermitage with this richness with food is very interesting. Like for instance, also the curry. You take a curry lamb, that's a perfect wine which will play with the curry. And so what I want you to remark is that here we have the richness, the elegancy of the alluvion, that's sediment from the Quaternaire, some glacier sediment and loess. And in the past, this parcel was not considered as some of the three big parcels of Hermitage. The three big parcels of Hermitage were Greffieux, Méal, and Bessard. Because the people were obsessed by the percentage of alcohol. The great lack of Hermitage for the 19th century was a wine which was naturally producing a high level of alcohol. And what is interesting in this place of Les Murets, where Philippe has also some vineyard, it is the elegancy of this soil. On sediment, we don't look for the power, we look for the complexity. What I want you to remark is in the tasting is that is the crescendo between the nose, the taste, and the length in aftertaste. We always keep in mind that when we vinify, the wine has to be married with food. We don't want to have a machist marriage. That's the wine must not cover the food. A good marriage is when you have complementarity, not when you are when you have a dominant person with a subordinated person. I always try to explain that to my wife. It's difficult, And so for the wine, that's the same thing. For instance, Sauterne with foie gras, that's something we kill the foie gras. The Sauterne is good, but never a sweet wine with the foie gras if you like the foie gras. So what is interesting is we have a very interesting wine for the high gastronomy. And here when you taste, that's the length. And we're helped by the signature of the bitterness, but remark also in the middle of the tongue, the level of saltiness. The microbiology in the soil, the oligoelements and the salt are absorbed not by osmosis, but only through the bacteria in the soil. And that's interesting because we can be focused on this by the level of saltiness. And more you have life in the soil, more you have saltiness in the wine.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly get that high degree of sapidity in this particular wine. You get that great length and mouth-watering finish that encourages all of us to have another sip. So that's pretty special. Anyway, we've reached the end of the formal tasting, right? If you have questions, please enter them in the chat. We'll get to as many of them as we can. Thanks for joining us, and thanks Michel and Philippe for sharing your wines with us today. We'll get right into the questions. It looks like we've got a bunch. Maybe we start with Philippe. Question number 1. What are the differences in viticulture and winemaking approach when you want to make great wine in Côte-Rôtie versus Hermitage?
Wow, I think I understood your question, even if I don't see you and you might have gone. But I could take 2 hours to answer the questions, because there are only differences, let's say, in viticulture and vinification between Côte-Rôtie and Hermitage. My first answer, viticulture. Let's say the infrastructures of the 2 vineyards are very different. You have a vineyard of Ermitage that starts very, very gentle. So most of Ermitage has a slope that starts very gentle, very little on the top. And for example, we can use horses in Ermitage on the gentle beginning of the slope in Ermitage. Côte-Rôtie, I think you have to be a little bit mad or wild to work in Côte-Rôtie, because there's nothing on the flat part and the slope starts straight away. So we don't see many animals such as horses in Côte-Rôtie, for example. Another difference could be, let's say, in the pruning of the vines. Hermitage is using the traditional gobelet bush vine pruning. In Côte-Rôtie, we still have the historical pruning of Côte-Rôtie, which is a simple guyot, so with a cane. So it's another difference, for example, in the vineyards. In terms of vinification, I think anybody can have the type of vinification that he believes will reflect the most his terroir and his expression. I would say that generally speaking, in Côte-Rôtie, we try to be very gentle with the Côte Blondes, and we have less hesitation for the Brune, where we have more power and more structure in the potential of the grapes. So yes, maybe I would think of Red Hermitage a little bit more like, let's say, a Brune side of Côte-Rôtie. But yes, back to viticulture's extremely different practices and different habits as well.
Right, Michel? I mean, you're coming from an Hermitage-centric perspective, perhaps. How do you see the differences?
For me, it's difficult to answer this question, because by my obsession to prove that the soil in the terroir, I come back, terroir is the soil, the climate, and the human. Terroir is not only the soil, but the part of the terroir, which is the soil, has the ability to give a characteristic to the wine. In our winery, we obliged us to say we don't make difference of work, to be able to make the subtraction, same vintage, same vine growing, same winemaking. The only one difference between different single vineyards is just the soil by subtraction. So it's more difficult for me to answer, because the way we try always to have the same work. So a point of Philippe said was interesting, that on the pruning, the Guyot has been forbidden in Hermitage, because and I think it is a mistake, because people used to say the Guyot produced high yield, and for this reason we forbid that in Hermitage, which is a mistake, because when you start to have old vines which are producing less, then that's interesting to be on Guyot, because you are able to still have an interesting yield. When you are on Gobelet, when you have old vines, then you have a drop of the yield, which is sometimes dramatic and push people to replant. And with Philippe, we share the point of view that older is your vine, better it is. And keep in mind, roots of vines can go 200 feet, even meters down. And if we want to extract the soil, we need to push our roots. And it is also, again, a great lack we have in the north of the Rhone, where we have metamorphic and magmatic soil, because there is some fields where roots can go very deep, which is not the case on limestone.
Okay. Second question. Michel, you've got some experience working in other countries. Is there a reason why Viognier has made a name for itself as a varietal wine and not Roussanne or Marsanne, although they are commonly used and produce outstanding wines such as the Hermitage Blanc?
Um, I really believe that Marsanne, or Roussanne at first, was known for the ability to oxidate. And as I told you in the past, people like to have oxidated or maderized wine. So the obsession for people was, how can we do a wine to be ready earlier or quicker, a wine to be quicker oxidated. And for that, the Roussanne was used as a patina, you know. But when this taste of the 19th century or beginning of the 20th century has disappeared in a new wine region, people were absolutely not interested to have this sort of of taste. And it is true that when you work on the Roussanne and the Marsanne, you have some grapes which are difficult to work, extremely difficult, and the potential of oxidation, it's like to work on eggs, and it's an art to work these grapes. Then after the Viognier, we have to keep in mind that the Viognier was on the point to disappear, and the Viognier was on the point to disappear because, and thanks, like we say, Marcel Guigal saved the Côte-Rôtie, and ah,
Georges
aide-moi, Philippe.
Georges
Georges
Georges Vernet.
Vernet. Georges Vernet saved Condrieu, because these two appellations 50 years ago were very, very small, and Condrieu and Viognier were on the point to disappear. So the very aromatic signature of the Viognier push probably people to plant the Viognier for the aromatic signature of the Viognier. And the Viognier is not only this signature, this aromatic signature. Um, when I was in California, it was a discussion that I had quite often. People were speaking about fruit. I think we speak more about texture. Sometimes, to be a little provocative, I used to say, fruit is to the wine what the disco is to the music. So what is interesting is the texture, that is the noble flavors, that is all this in more than the fruit.
Right. Philippe, any opinions on why Viognier has gained much more traction internationally than Marsanne or Roussanne?
As Michel said, Viognier was probably underrepresented in the past. 55 years ago, there were maybe 8 or 9 hectares of Viognier planted on planet Earth, and it was the Condrieu appellation. So the Viognier almost disappeared with Condrieu. We have replanted our own appellation, but it's true that the Viognier has traveled down the southern part of the Rhone Valley, the Ardèche district, the Languedoc, of course. It's been planted in Australia, in New Zealand, in California, of course. We see interesting examples of Viognier in Washington States, for example. From what I see, the Viognier has very interesting expressions in the different terroirs where it's shown, where it's planted. And there has been a time, maybe 15 years ago, when I was hearing an interesting sentence or an interesting comment. A lot of winemakers were saying Viognier is the Chardonnay of the Rhone Valley. because it is true that it was a grape that was traveling all around the world and that was very popular. I'm using the past because very quickly people have discovered that the major difference between Viognier and Chardonnay is that I know good, if not decent Chardonnays that are produced at high yields. And Viognier is a type of grape, is a grape variety that does not stand high yields. So my feeling is that when you've crossed 40 hectoliters per hectare, the Viognier is becoming extremely watery. It's lacking, density, dry extract, expression. The aromas are not there anymore. So there's a break to Viognier, which is the yields. But if you keep low yields and you're very careful with your vinification, you're very careful with your balance. We already talked about the over ripeness of the Viognier. It can work. It can work extremely well. Regarding Marsanne and Roussanne, I don't know. I have tasted, Chateau Bilk in Australia, where they have, an old vision of using the Marsanne there, for example. The Roussanne has always been popular in southern Rhone, so it's just a different vision, probably.
Great. We're going to stick with a sort of New World theme here. The next question. Do you guys have a favorite Napa Shiraz? And do you notice any trends in Californian winemaking styles? Well, it's probably a tough one for you guys, having not been able to travel to California for a few years. But Philippe, you want to address that? Do you have a favorite Syrah expression coming out of California?
Well,
We'll broaden it past.
Yes, interestingly, you mentioned Napa, and I was about to say that I am very familiar with what is done in Paso Robles, what is done in Santa Ynez, in Santa Barbara. So to answer the question of Napa, Napa Syrah, I can remember an interesting visit of Anne Colgan many years ago now, and of course I had the chance to taste these wines that are beautiful wines. More generally speaking, I am quite a big fan of Schaefer in Napa with a Syrah, and I think it gives good results. Otherwise, if we talk about California, generally speaking, I have a great experience of John Alban and many others that I truly love. They are beautiful expressions of Syrah in California in my mind.
Michel, do you want to try to zero in on Napa? And I think there's probably one or two to enjoy.
Me, when I was at the Grace Family Vineyards, on this time it was Camus who used to make their wine, but it was the time when Craig Williams was just arriving at Phelps. And what was interesting, that was the work that Craig did on the research of the Syrah, and I was extremely impressed by the quality of the work of Craig Williams. So I have a tenderness, an affection for this wine, but probably the best Syrah I've ever tasted from the New World wines is the Syrah of the husband of Carol Meredith from UC Davis. Help me, Joe. Yes,
Steve Lagier. You're right.
yes.
So Lagier Meredith.
Yeah, that was, but it's quite impossible to find, huh? like Grace Family Vineyards.
No, I think I'm still on that mailing list, although I haven't ordered from them for a while. So, if anyone is out there and is interested, it's Lagier Meredith, Carol Meredith, who worked at Davis and, of course, did so many great studies on grape genealogy. And her husband Steve is really the muscle, I guess, behind the operation. He's the guy in the vineyard and the guy on the forklift and everything in between. So, yeah, pretty cool property. I think I still have a couple of bottles from their first few releases in my cellar. So, yeah, good stuff. What else do we have question wise? Okay, so here's one. Joe has indicated in his reviews some pretty impressive drinking windows for many of the wines tasted today. Yeah, I think these wines last and evolve and improve, in some cases for decades. What processes used by Philippe and Michel in the winemaking and aging of their wines allow such longevity? And do you experiment with new aging techniques such as amphoras? Um, I don't know. I mean, I don't think these guys are really doing that much in terms of tricks in the winemaking. We've talked about it a little bit. There's indigenous yeasts. There's, anywhere from 3 to 8 weeks of vatting time. There's aging in oak barrels. Guys, am I missing something? Are you doing some wizardry in the cellars to make these wines able to age? I mean, my feeling is, at least with the reds, it's the anti-oxidative native nature of the variety. Philippe, you want to comment first on that?
Yes, with pleasure. I don't know if it's really answers I'm going to give you, but for sure stories. Two stories. The first one, which is a funny one, is that every winemaker in Northern Rhone, we are happy to welcome young people for their internship or their stage at the winery every year for the vintage. And when I meet the young people studying enology for the first time at the winery, they all have little stars in their eyes. And the story is always the same. We're going to spend 4 months at Guigal, and during these 4 months, we're going to get the secret of La Mouline, La Turque, and La Landonne. And what I can tell you is that once they've gone after 4 months, the stars have gone. They've not seen anything. That is to say, there's nothing very special to see in the cellars regarding the vinification. There's no, exceptional technique in order to make that the wines will have a long aging possibility. Another story is, let's say, I am happy to share with you the philosophy that we have behind the winemaking at Guigal. I am myself an enologist, and it is true that generally speaking, enologists have a trend to counterbalance things. So let's say in a vintage like last vintage, 2020, it's a warm vintage where things are going extremely well very quickly. That is to say, we can see the colors, the anthocyanins running out in the juice after a few hours, and we can see wines that have tannins density quite quickly. A vintage like 2021 is another story. It takes more time for the color to get out, even if there's quite a significant amount of color this year. But let's say on weaker vintages, a lot of winemakers, a lot of enologists would have the trend to say, okay, the vintage is not exactly showing how it should, so we should do a little bit more pumping over, we should do a little bit more extraction. And of course, in a big vintage like 2015, they would think exactly the opposites. They would think that, naturally there's a lot of power, there's a lot of tannins, there's a lot of structure. So they should be careful not to extract too much in order to counterbalance this. I very much understand this speech, and of course I respect it, but I think exactly the opposite. I think that when the nature says that the vintage is big, that there is color and tannins, we should use them and we should express them. So I'm very happy to have longer vattings, and show a lot of oxygen and go more in the density style of the wine. Whereas in a lighter vintage, and we can talk about 2008, for example, where you have extremely delicate tannins and lighter color, I believe that if we extract more, we're going to show more tannins, we're going to show more things that shouldn't be seen in the wines. So in this case, I would be extremely gentle in the pumping over or in the pigeage, for example. So it partially answers your question. We don't do something specific, let's say, to do wines that age forever. I think we both do wines that are matching well with their terroir. And as Michel said, the terroir includes the climate and the microclimate. So the vintage is truly essential for expressive wines.
Great. Thanks for that, Philippe. Michel, you have any comments on the secrets to making age-worthy wines?
No, I think it's What said Philippe, I shared his point of view, and one important point is to have our cellar open for the flying winemakers and the student winemakers. That's there is never secret. The best way to become a loser is to have some secret, because it is exactly what's happened to the French gastronomy in the 70s and the 80s. They thought they were the best in the world, and then didn't realize on this time that some other nation were starting to be better than them. And the wine in the French wines in the 90s had quite the same superiority complex. So the best way, if you think that you are better than the neighbor, if you want to be always competitive, give your secret to everybody. That's oblige you to continue to work fast and to continue to discover new things. Um, One point I just wanted to say, I think I have heard speaking about R4 wines or things like that. That's quite scary, you know. There's this new fashion of oxidated wines. And that's scary because I've heard that, for instance, in Canada, they start to ask to make some orange wines or things like that. And that's marketing wines. That's not AOC wines. That's brown wines which are done with marketing. You put money in the marketing and you make publicity. That's not our job. We make the marketing of the offer. We are here to take the pictures of the terroir. And like when you go in a gallery to buy a painting, you don't ask to the painter, said, "I buy your painting if you put more yellow." No, if you don't like, you don't buy it. And I like to say that when we make a wine, the best example is the teacher in music class. You listen the music, you say, not good, I don't like it. Then the teacher is explaining you the music, and then you say, finally the music is interesting. And after you say, oh, the music is beautiful. You didn't change the music, but the teacher has caught your attention to the interesting point. That's the work of the people like us. That's the work of the sommelier. And it is important that if you go the fashion of the natural wines, where because of the oxidation you lose not only the soil signature, but you lose also the grape signature. That's absolutely outside of the philosophy of the all Europe, where we defend the notion of the appellation contrôlée. And amphor wine is interesting. Okay, it's a new marketing fashion. It's not, for me, a strong point, because systematically with the exchange and the oxidation, I accept the oxidation, or sometimes you will discover by an accident a new style of wine. Probably what's happened in Jura 400 years ago with the vin jaune. But when you taste the vin jaune in Jura, it's the perfection. They know exactly what they do, and they control perfectly the oxidation. What I reproach to the fashion of the vin naturel and the amphor wines, they don't. They just try to sell an accident, but the accident is never the same place, and there is no terroir. So sorry, I am a little hard for this point, but I try to defend the philosophy of the French terroir and the AOC philosophy.
No, thanks, Michel. That gets us back to one of the parts of that original question. And Philippe, maybe you want to talk about it. Have you guys experimented with amphora? Because not every amphora has to be sort of open with extended skin contact, right? You can have a sealed lid and treat it much like
Mm.
any other aging vessel.
Well, in my opinion, I didn't have the opportunity to experiment amphoras, but from what I understand with amphoras is the fact that the clay of the amphora makes that oxygen goes through. And think of the poor Philippe Guigal aging his wine for 40 months in New York, which is quite a lot of oxygen. And you add an amphora to this, it's just impossible. So, you know, we need a balance in what we want to do. And for sure, I already know that amphora would not be adapted to what we're doing, you know. I did not mention the fact that we are using closed stainless steel vats for the vinification, not even open vats, because I think this would be too much oxygen considering the style of aging that I do afterwards. So yes, my answer to your question is that a vinification in amphora would not match with the style of aging that I want to do afterwards.
Right. Okay, we're going to switch things up. The next question is about the whole idea of cruise, I guess, in the Northern Rhone. So the question is, Cornas and Saint-Péray often get very good reviews and scores. Would you consider them as the premier crus of the Northern Rhone, while Côte-Rôtie and Hermitage would be the Grand Cru? And if so, why are they still relatively underrated and unheard of compared with other Northern Rhone appellations? Cornas and Saint-Péray. Let's start with that. Cornas and Saint-Péray. Philippe, you guys don't make Cornas and Saint-Péray, do you guys?
Exactly. I am not an expert of Cornas, neither Saint-Péray, because we don't produce any. It's a very interesting question because, well, first there are two questions. One is about why Cornas or Saint-Péray haven't reached, let's say, the renown of Hermitage, Côte-Rôtie, or the top Northern Rhone appellations. Well, I don't have a precise answer, but maybe the size is an answer. You know, we forget to say that Cornas is just a little bit more than 100 hectares, maybe 111, something like that. And what people don't necessarily realize is that there are more or less 80 growers in Cornas. So you realize that the average property in Cornas is extremely small, and this is probably not helping in the distribution of the wines because, you know, it's extremely limited number of bottles per property, and it's not helping, let's say, in the communication of the appellation. Saint-Péray is an appellation that is rediscovered right now. I'm sure Michel will have a great expertise on Saint-Péray. You know, regarding the crus, the Premier Cru, the Grand Cru, there's a lot of talks about reintroducing Premier Cru or Grand Cru in the Rhone Valley. I would say both Michel and I are not the best people to talk about it, simply because we are historical houses in the way that we have some of the very best spots within the actions where we work. So of course, it would be something that would be interesting for our wineries. But more generally speaking, it's a very political question. You know, there is a history and a background in the Rhone Valley which is real. If you talk about Côte-Rôtie and take a look at the 1910s, the 1920s, you know, just looking at a famous retailer in France called Nicolas. If you ask to look at the catalogs, the price list of Nicolas at the beginning of the past century, you can notice three different Côte-Rôties. You notice the Côte-Rôtie Blanc, the white Côte-Rôtie that has disappeared today. You notice the Côte-Rôtie, and you notice the Côte-Rôtie Premier Cru. And very clearly, it's written on the price list, there were a notion of Premier Cru in Côte-Rôtie at the beginning of the past century. Is it a good thing to do it again? Is it a way to classify the different appellations in the Rhone Valley? Probably. How is it going to be done? It's another question. And when is even a bigger question, because what we see from the INAO, the National Institute of Wine, is that the three pillars of the INAO are, in French, les usages locaux, loyaux et constants, meaning local, loyal, and constant use. And unfortunately, there is no constant use regarding Premier Cru or Grand Cru in the Rhone Valley. So of course, we can always adapt our appellations to different factors. It can be the global warming with introduction of new grapes. You know, there have been new grapes introduced in Côte-du-Rhône, for example, in the past years, but for sure it takes quite a while. So I am happy not to be too old but I am not sure that I will see Premier Cru or Grand Cru in the Rhone Valley.
Great. And Michel, you're actually involved with the INAO, right?
Oh yeah, because I'm in the Commission Nationale and in the Commission Permanente and the Conseil Permanent, which is like the member of the board. So that's some discussion which could be which uh, which could be in discussion, but like say Philippe, as a member of the board of the NAO, it's not easy for me to push the Rhone Valley, but the Rhone Valley to do this move. But Philippe Pellaton, the new president of the Inter-Rhone and president of the regional committee of INAO, said, "Wait, that could make sense that the Côte-Rôtie North, the Cru, could be in Premier Cru, which is easier for the NAO than to speak of Grand Cru, which is another appellation when you make a Grand Cru. Premier Cru, it is hierarchization of the appellation. If you arrive at the Grand Cru, you create a new appellation, which is much more complicated. So there is an idea, and I will come back with on the one part of the question. What about the Saint-Joseph, the Saint-Péray, the Cornas? I take off Cornas of my explanation because it's a little different, but if I take Saint-Péray and Saint-Joseph, these wine which were quite affordable in price for the wine uh, didn't permit the extension so much of the vineyards in slope. You have to consider that when you plant with a wall, you are easily at 500, 600,000 euro just of walls per hectare. Then after, when you work, because you can't have mechanization, you will speak of 1,200, sometimes 1,500 hours per hectare. That means that naturally, when the Saint-Péray, Saint-Joseph were not very well known and the wine was less expensive, the people could only plant the vineyards on the flatland, and very few people could plant on the slope. People like winery like Guigal, Chapoutier could take the money from other vineyards, the profit from other vineyards, to start to replant the slope. If we take the example, the total appellation of Saint-Péray has a potential of 2,000 hectares, and there is quite only 100 which are planted. But like Saint-Péray, like Saint-Joseph, the best historical vineyards are probably not yet planted because they were too expensive to grow. And that slowly and slowly, you see that people are replanting no more the flatland, which was not as interesting, but the slope, because the price of the Saint Joseph or the Saint-Péray is higher. So the vine grower who is a little more richer is able now to pay the transformation of this old vineyards which became forest and to bring them back in vineyards. And that's mean what? That's mean that in an appellation like Saint Joseph, you will have the flatland, which is lower quality than the slope. On flatland, you will be at 250 hours per hectare, when you will be in the slope at 1,200 hours per hectare. For me, that makes sense that the slope will be, when there is the quality of the soil, of course, will be pushed as a Premier Cru compared to the rest, which is not able to be a Premier Cru. And so that will be probably the logic of the history, because the future of Saint Joseph will be the future vineyards which will be planted, and that will be where people will find the biggest surprise. But that is the same thing with Saint-Péray. So it's different with Cornas because they were enough clever to keep planted the slope, but not enough clever to protect their vineyards with the new construction. You know, that's the biggest danger because they are close to Valence. The biggest danger is that during a long time, if you were selling your soil to build a house, it was more, the cost was more expensive than the soil to plant a vineyard. So a part of the cornice has been lost because of the construction. And the work we are doing with the NAO is to say we have to block this, the historical vineyard in even the Appalachian area, even if they are not planted, cannot be taken away for construction of building and houses. Of course, people want to be in the mountains with a beautiful view. So they were successful in Côte-Rôtie because they protected their vineyards. That was not the case in Cornas. That was one of the problems. Sorry, I
Yeah,
was
that's
long. Eh?
no, that's okay. I think it's an interesting point that we've heard about these sorts of situations in, for example, Bordeaux, where houses have basically expanded over much of the Grave region, and you have some estates that are basically entirely surrounded by housing developments now. But we don't really think of it in terms of the Rhone. But the northern Rhone in particular is quite sensitive to this because the areas we're talking about are quite small.
And keep in mind that the region, the Rhône-Alpes region, we call now Auvergne-Rhône-Alpes region, is the region with the most dynamic economy in France, front of PACA, front of all the other region.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
plenty of people are moving to our region.
Okay. We're gonna switch things up. The next question is about the southern Rhone. So here we go. Little change up. And it says Southern Rhone wines can be blends of many grape varieties, and this is due to them being historically part of the local terroir. Why isn't Petite Syrah one of them? And I guess by Petite Syrah, the question then is referring to the grape variety Durif, uh, not Petite Syrah in the form of Serine, the small berried Syrah. Anyone want to take on Durif and why it is or isn't allowed?
I don't know. It's hard to give a straight answer like this, but yes, just to remind people, the Petite Syrah is, or the Durif, we name it Durif in France, is the cross between the Syrah and the Pélursin, which is let's say a local grape here. We don't see it in the Rhone Valley. It's originally from the Rhone. It's been sent to the US many years ago, and there's been a confusion between Petite Syrah and Syrah. And it's probably one of the questions we answer the most when we travel to the US with Michel, I'm sure. Let's say once again with AOC systems, the things are quite straight in the way that talking about grape varietals, if we talk about Châteauneuf-du-Pape, we have the 13 grapes that are in reality 18 grapes when you look at the different colors. And you see the real potential of these grapes when you have, issues such as drought, global warming, etc. We now start to realize that there are tertiary or secondary grapes that are interesting to have in the blends. When it is about Northern Rhone, we don't think of blends. We have Syrah and Syrah as a red grape. We have three varietals for the whites that are Viognier, Roussanne, and Marsanne. So let's say the situation is quite different. Dury for Petite Syrah or Zinfandel in the Rhone vineyards. Honestly, I don't know. What is very clear is that on the past 6 vintages, because they were extremely warm vintages and ripe vintages, we could have thought of it. With a vintage like 2021, you come back to the reality, which is the fact that we are northern Rhone regions here, and we needed time to get the sufficient ripeness of the Syrah in 2021. We have harvested in October, and it has been very different from what we've seen in the past 6 vintages. So yes, it's not for tomorrow, Joe, I'm afraid.
That's okay. Michel, do you want to weigh in on Durif and yeah, what about the idea of planting something exotic like Zinfandel, or authorizing other grape varieties in at least in the southern Rhone. I mean, if Bordeaux can plant Tempranillo or things like that, uh,
No, Bordeaux
why can't
cannot
the
plant
Rhone?
Tempranillo. No, but you're right. Bordeaux is not Tempranillo, but it's Toriga Nacional that
Okay.
they have asked to have the Toriga Nacional. Me personally, I defended the notion of Toriga Nacional in Roussillon because that's clever. Finally, Grenache is not a French grape; it is a Spanish grape, and we were happy to. Okay, it's a few centuries ago that's arrived in the Rhone, and but I really think that when you have region with we have the great lack to be in monogrape, and I would say the seigneur of the wines and the kings of the wines are the region with monograpes. That's Burgundy and the north of the Rhone. Um, I I really believe that historically that was when people started to blend. It was not to make better; it was to go against problem or to go against defect. When people started to blend against the Grenache, it was the sensitivity of the Grenache for the oxidation, but it was also the sensitivity of the Grenache for the coulure. So it was also an economic reason. So in our region, to be to have been able to protect our patrimoines of. It's a big discussion today in the now because there is a discussion in the Jura where they want to bring some southern grapes of the south, and I think it could be a big mistake if they would do that because they are the Pulsar, they have the Trousseau, so they have some extremely interesting grape characteristic of their region. And one of the risks is that today, if we want to plant all the grapes everywhere, then the notion of AOC will die. I understand that when you are, in the AOC philosophy, the winemaker is under the signature of the terroir, is not the king. I would say that the vine grower is the boss, and the winemaker follow the vine grower. When you are not in an AOC philosophy, the winemaker is the person who will personalize the style, and he has a marketing approach and he puts his signature. So there is not this notion of terroir. The philosophy is completely different. So you can play with the different grapes. But that's that's scaring when you say when you see that plenty of grape go everywhere because we will lose the tradition. But in the same time, we must not be stupid. Keep in mind that the Chardonnay is quite 110 years old, not more. And if they would have not planted the Chardonnay in Burgundy, especially in Champagne, what would be the Burgundy today? It's not an old grape Chardonnay. It's 110 years old, maybe 120. But if I say like an old stupid person, oh, by the tradition, I don't want new grapes, probably there were people like that against the Chardonnay at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. Happily, that some people had the courage to defend the Chardonnay. So when we had the proposition in the NAO to have the Toriga National, which is for me one of the best grapes in the world, to be integrated in France. For Bordeaux, I don't know. For Roussillon, that's absolutely clever. That's the grape of Porto. But I've planted some in Australia, Toriga National, and the results are amazing. So, as we say in French, une réponse de Normand. Not yes, not no.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I find it interesting that, for example, the Côte du Rhône can include portions of Marcelin and Caladoc, but other varieties are still not really accepted outside of the more traditional Rhone varieties. Is that sort of just French chauvinism, or is that because those contain a Grenache component as part of their parentage?
Philippe say the notion of constant. Uh, to integrate a new grape, you have to integrate a new grape. You need to have minimum of 10 years of experimentation, and the best way is to have 20 years of experimentation, and then maybe you can be able to integrate in AOC for maximum 10%. So today in a AOC organization, we have created, because of the evolution of climate, the work to there is a commission which is working on the possibility to create some exception because of the evolution of the climate. But normally it is extremely slow, extremely slow. That we will have another question which is arriving, which is this new, an AOC can be done with a hybrid, but there is the retro hybrid. In the past we were speaking of 50%. That was a cross of two. But with the retro cross, a hybrid can be only with 2%, 98% vitis vinifera, and 2% of another race. So the Europe has just changed the text. That means that today AOC can have some grape which are coming by a crossing, by a hybrid, with a hybrid, and with 2% of the Lambrusca or another the Riperia in. The good point is it's naturally resistance against mildew, power mildew, and the resistance. But that's interesting. But just to understand, the chance to find a grapes is 1 on 100 million. That is exactly the same cross that you have with the Chardonnay and the Gamay. That's the same parents. They are brother sister. Just that means that when we start again and we are doing a new clone, so we lose completely the varietal. So these questions are extremely difficult to take, because we have to be progressist, but in the same time, it's not because you will take the parents of the Syrah are the white Mondeuse and the Dureza. But if you take a white Mondeuse and the Dureza, you cross them, you have one chance of 100 million to find a Syrah. So you will never have a Syrah again.
Right.
Sorry, I was
Philippe,
on this question.
Philippe, a quick one for you. Your sort of big volume Côte-Rôtie Rouge, let's take that as an example. It's Syrah heavy, always has been. Do you include some Marcelin or Caladoc in that blend?
In very small proportion, we do include some Marcelin.
Okay.
I am myself more a fan of Marcelin than Caladoc. So Marcelin is a grape that is interesting to me as long as you give it a little bit of time. The good news is that we've got a lot of time at Guigal. So yes, there is probably between 1% and 2% of Marcelin in the red Côte-Rôtie. Absolutely.
Right. And just for everyone's edification, that's a crossing between Grenache and Cabernet Sauvignon, correct?
I think it is.
Which one you say?
Okay.
Marcelin.
Marcelin.
Oui, Barcelone, c'est ça, c'est ça. Et Caladoc, c'est Côte et Grenache.
Yeah,
This is
Malbec.
it.
And we have very interesting is the Couston. The Couston, which is the
Couston.
old Métis.
Yes, Couston is interesting in the northern southern Rhone. That is to say, in the Ardèche sector,
Ardèche.
there is
It's
historically
old
some
Métis.
Couston planted, and we see interesting results of Couston that we use as well. Absolutely.
I consider it more interesting than the Marcelin because it's an old Métis. Very interesting.
All right. Looks
Okay.
like we're getting to the end. We got one more question
good.
that I see at the moment. It's I guess a question that periodically comes up. about irrigation. So, in the context of a warmer climate, heat waves, and occasional drought, is it still sustainable for Rhone winemakers to continue not irrigating their vineyards? And will access to water resources become a debate in the near future for Rhone viticulture? Philippe, you want to start?
Believe it or not, the Rhone is using irrigation. I'm thinking of an appellation like Châteauneuf-du-Pape, for example. You have sectors of Châteauneuf-du-Pape where the droughts became so catastrophic in the past years that it is sectors that we know where we have much better results when we have irrigation compared to others. Now, because we're French and we love laws, we have, of course, a limitation and a restriction in the irrigation. We cannot irrigate whatever we want, whenever we want, etc., etc. Once again, the climate change is a reality, so we have to evolve. I don't see, let's say, irrigation as a bad thing in Southern Rhone. In Northern Rhone, I don't think we're here yet. The future will tell. Michel will probably have his own point of view on this, but it's a matter of placing conditions for the vines to give their best. By this, I mean that we all know that if we give a plant, a vine, everything it wants, everything it would get, we would produce a misery wine. So it's a balance between some efforts and a natural capacity for the vine to express. I think it's exactly like people. If you drink as much wines as you would think, maybe you wouldn't be in good shape by the end of the day. So you have to self-control a little bit. It's a little bit like this for the plants.
And Michel, what are your thoughts on irrigation?
So the irrigation, like said Philippe, is we can irrigate in the Rhone Valley in France now, but you can't irrigate from August to the harvest. But when you irrigate, you are obliged to have a low yield. That means you have the regular basic yield. I am in the commission of irrigation in the NO, and the discussion we have today is to say we will probably change. We will make a proposition to change the rules to be able to irrigate after in August, because one of the consequences that sometime, if we can't irrigate, you have some warm weather where you will over concentrate the grape, and you will have what I call the jammy wines. And one of the idea is today to let the people the freedom. So we keep still the notion of yield. If you ask the permission to irrigate, that means if you want to irrigate, you have to ask, but that means you will be obliged to have a low yield. Because the problem is the excess. If you don't put this rule, that means that you will stay at 40 hectoliters per hectare. So 40 hectoliters per hectare, it is 2.5 ton per acre, to speak in another way. So you can't go above 2.5 ton per acre when you irrigate. And so
Yeah, and I mean,
we have to, yeah, go on.
sorry,
Vas-y,
the
vas-y.
original intent of these prohibitions on irrigation was to prevent people from having yields that were high and making bad wine. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that the there were a tradition with French farmers in cheating, and so the customs, and we are followed by the customs, and they were always scared. That was, we had. It was funny because during a long time it was forbidden to chaptalize and to acidify in the same time. When you make enology, people say that if you chaptalize, you have to acidify. The reason, and that's quite stupid, but that was the administrative reason. In the time, the only one way for the fraud to discover if somebody had cheated, that was by the dry extract calculation. But if somebody was chaptalizing and making acidification, they couldn't control. So the only one reason of they forbid the chaptalization and acidification was because they wanted the control organization to do their job correctly. And you have plenty of things in France which are done because they said, okay, we don't want to give the irrigation because plenty of people will not follow the rules and will go too far. And it was for this reason that but not only in France, because when we say it's not France which is like that, it is south of Europe. We call that Latin Europe, and because more south you go, more it is like that.
Well, great. I guess that wraps up the question. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you to Michel and Philippe for staying up and being with us this whole time. Appreciate it. And Michel, you must be hungry by now.
Yeah. Now it's for what? Champagne and sushi.
All right. Thanks, everyone. And don't forget, you can always watch the rerun, I guess, of the program, I think, by checking out the robertparker.com website. And of course, we encourage you to reach out to all of us via social media. I think we're on Facebook and Instagram and all that stuff. And of course, if you're talking about the event, please use the hashtags Robert Parker and Wine Advocate. And of course, you can mention Chapoutier and Guigal too. So thanks a lot, guys. Really appreciate your time. And thanks everyone out there for joining in. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Yep.
Cheers.